Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
How's everyone doing?
Wonderful.
Good, good. Ready to get down to a little work with Parashat Bo. It's one of those great short words. Parashat Bo deals with the actual Exodus. Finally, right? Get out of Egypt, pass go, collect 200 shekels, and move on towards the land of Israel. But the part that we're going to look at today deals with the most widely observed Jewish ritual in contemporary Jewish society, which is, what's that? Passover. More specifically, the Seder. Because you'll find that even people that have a lovely ham and cheese sandwich on the fourth day of Passover are still doing something with matzah and something like a retelling of the story of the Exodus on Erev Pesach, during the time of the Seder. It is an amazingly compelling ritual that has remained part of even the lives of people that have felt distant from Judaism. But is everybody welcome? Is everybody welcome at the Seder? Yes? Yes? Oh, well, we're done then. We don't have to talk about anything else. Well, let's take a look, because at the first Seder, when we were offering the first Pesach offering, the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice of Pesach, was everyone invited to chow down? The ones that were hungry? Well, actually, maybe whether you were hungry or not, you were supposed to be eating.
Well, actually, no, you couldn't, because that's why they had the second time you could come.
So we know that later on there's going to be this makeup Seder that's involved. That is to say, if you were unable to participate in the first Seder, that is to say the actual Seder in Nisan, that a month later there would be a makeup opportunity for people who had been ritually impure, who were away from the country at the time and couldn't come to the altar to offer up the sacrifice. They get a makeup opportunity. But I'm talking about a different category of people. I'm talking about the stranger. I'm talking about non-Jews, or maybe Jews. Were there Jews who weren't allowed to have this Passover sacrifice? These questions and more will be answered in today's exciting episode. So we got to get a little text under our belt before we can begin to digest it, before we can begin to eat it. So let's go ahead and we're going to take a look at page 389 in the Chumash, which is chapter 12, verse 40 of the book of Exodus. How are we doing? Like I said, it's page 389 if you're in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. Otherwise, Exodus 12, verse 40 to begin. Wow, I think... I think we're going to just make it from the number of copies. We have a bumper crop of attendees today. All right, so who'd like to lead us off in our English reading? Please.
The length of time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430th year, to the very day, all the ranks of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt. That was for the Lord a night of vigil, to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is the Lord's one of vigil for all the children of Israel throughout the ages.
All right, so if you're wondering about the length of time that we spent in Egypt, look up last year's class where we talked about this number of 430. We're going to keep moving on.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the law of the Passover offering. No foreigner shall eat of it, but any slave a man has bought may eat of it once he has been circumcised. No bound or hired laborer shall eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break a bone of it. The whole community of Israel shall offer it. If a stranger who dwells with you would offer the Passover to the Lord, all his males must be circumcised. Then he shall be admitted to offer it. He shall then be as a citizen of the country. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. There shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you. And all the Israelites did so. As the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. That very day the Lord freed the Israelites from the land of Egypt, troop by troop.
Well, isn't that clear? Any restrictions on this thing called Korban Pesach, this Pesach offering? Yeah. Wait a minute. Okay. What's that? You bet. So, who doesn't get to eat it? Okay, so we've got this, I'm going to abbreviate because circumcised just takes too long to write more than once. The uncircumcised are not allowed to eat it. Strangers, but is that a separate category? Is that a subcategory? Is that a parallel category? Is that a synonym? Do strangers mean the uncircumcised?
No. So they use the word foreigner.
And then we also have this wonderful word, foreigner. Who are they, if not strangers?
And no bound or hired laborer.
And then we have this bound / hired labor, which also seem to be not to be eating. But are these bound and hired laborers Jews? Are they uncircumcised strangers? Are they foreigners even if they are circumcised? Are they... Judy, you have your hand up?
No.
Or are you just going, ah? Ah! What's going on here? Because we have a definite idea that there are some category of people, maybe more than one category of people, who should not be having the Korban Pesach. And then apparently every other Israelite is supposed to have it. Yes? Seems kind of important. Seems like God is making a concerted effort to make sure we understand this. And yet the language seems difficult to untangle. Maybe? Yes?
Well, as far as a stranger, they could be circumcised, but you wouldn't, if they were strangers, you wouldn't know it.
Yes, we don't go checking under every tunic. So someone who's a stranger in the definition that we use most often in modern English, somebody you don't know, you wouldn't know whether they're circumcised or not. They can be dressed in the most Jewish of ways, whatever that may mean, but that doesn't mean that they're circumcised. And indeed, is every Jew circumcised? I mean, men we're talking about.
You would hope so.
What's that?
You would hope so.
You would hope so? Are there any Jewish men that shouldn't be circumcised?
Not a Jew. Covenant.
A few, such as?
In the case where there's been a family problem where the boy babies bled to death.
Specifically, if the two older brothers, or even in a broader sense in families where it has been a running problem that the babies have died from the circumcision, you don't circumcise the subsequent boys because of the risk of their life.
They have to be two before they make that rule.
No, in some it has to be at least two. Yes.
At two.
Well, the first one that dies, you don't know if it's from a genetic problem, and the second one that dies, you circumcise because you didn't know the first one was going to be hereditary. But after the second one, you can see a pattern, and at that point, you don't need more examples to make you not want to do it. So yes, the second one is only because you weren't sure what the first one died of. And it's 2 is considered a pattern. Remember, they didn't have DNA tests back then.
But in today's life, we do have that ability to
Mhm.
check. So would they, in the case of illness where the child or the person could bleed to death?
If there is reason to believe, yes, if there is reason to believe, no, if you have reason to believe that a second child will suffer from a hemophiliac condition that would cause a similar problem, then absolutely you don't. I mean, the same way that in the ancient medical practice, a jaundiced baby was not circumcised immediately. They waited till the jaundice passed, even though modern medical practice tells us there's no reason life-threatening why you should delay a circumcision for a jaundiced child. The child is going to be able to recover just as typically as a non-jaundiced baby. We still refrain. We still postpone.
But I'm thinking about the life of that child as it grows and comes into the covenant.
Yes?
Is there a ceremony? Is there a breed without the milah?
Oh, you can still do a naming, absolutely.
Okay.
You can still do a naming, you can still declare this child. But a child is technically part of the covenant by virtue of birth, whether a circumcision is done or not. The circumcision doesn't make you more Jewish. It simply allows the parents to fulfill the mitzvah of circumcising their male children. So the technical identity of the child doesn't change with the circumcision. Now, if the child grows up uncircumcised for no, in quote, good reason, that is to say the parents just simply chose not to do it, as soon as the child is of bar mitzvah age and older, he is responsible for taking care of that himself. And by that I mean arranging to have it done properly, not he does it himself. It's not something that we assume that a person can actually perform on themselves. So then it becomes his responsibility to make sure the circumcision takes place. Make sense? All right, so but we still have this confusion now. Now that we understand that there can even be Jews who aren't circumcised, but we have this confusion of who is trying to be excluded from the Korban Pesach, who is trying to be left out. Okay? And we are left with a list. So uncircumcised is pretty straightforward, it would seem, to be referring to people who retain a foreskin, correct? Strangers, on the other hand, is a term that can mean many different things. The ger within Jewish understanding can mean both a stranger, that is to say somebody who is completely foreign to Judaism, but the ger can also mean, anyone? A convert. A ger is also the term that's used for a convert. And so we're going to want to make sure that we're really clear here to understand that, and I'll just cut to the chase on this one. Converts were allowed to partake in the Pesach sacrifice. That is to say, someone who had gone through a full conversion process. The rabbis debate somebody who is halfway there. Maybe they've had the circumcision, but they haven't gone to the mikveh yet. And that's, they think, might be one of the categories that's being excluded here, the people who have not finished their conversion. And then we have the case of foreigners, which, as we're going to see, is an unusual word that's being used for foreigner. If you flip back into page 389 and you look on verse verse 43, the words that are used in Hebrew for foreigner, it's not goy, it's not ger, it's not ger toshav, it's not any of the more typical words that we use for strangers or people that aren't part of our nation. It's kol ben nechar. All sons of nechar. Nechar comes from the same word that often gets used as nochri, as meaning a non-co-religionist, meaning somebody that is part of another religion, a non-member of our faith. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Might be another way to translate that. Or someone who is of alien disposition, alien faith.
This will use as no outsider.
Outsider, and again, the idea being that someone from a different set of beliefs. What's that?
A non-Israelite.
But it's not necessarily non-Israelite in terms of what's stamped on your passport. It's a non-Israelite in terms of what's stamped on your heart, on your faith system, which is why somebody could be a stranger but not be a foreigner. That is to say, someone could be not Jewish, but not necessarily part of an idolatrous faith, for example. They might be somebody that worships our God without having gone through the formal steps of conversion. And then they would be a stranger, but they wouldn't be a foreigner by this definition. And they could even be circumcised. Confusing, yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, we're going to look at just one small set of attempts to answer some of these questions, because answering all of them is beyond the scope of our limited time together, but it's hopefully at least beginning to whet your appetite, but there's, as often the case, a lot more going on. Take one and pass it on in our text than seems at first glance. I'm guessing that most of you, if you read through this, would probably just intuitively have thought, oh, these probably are all talking about the same group of people. But in fact, there are different categories being outlined here.
Are there any?
Do we have enough, or are we going to need to share a little bit? How are we doing? Yeah,
What was
Sal?
that term you used in front of a certain kind of Passover or Seder?
Korban. Korban, it means sacrifice. So one thing I should spell out very, very clearly is that there's a difference between the way we use the word Pesach now, which we use to refer to the whole holiday, right? And we talk about the Seder as being Pesach, and Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach was the actual sacrificed lamb that was sacrificed at the temple and eaten during the Seder. So Korban Pesach is the meat. And I mean that literally. It's the actual meat of the animal that was sacrificed at the altar but then eaten in the home.
So this is a very special occasion because of that.
Exactly. It's a very special occasion because of that. It's also very special because it's one of the few opportunities where someone can have a sacrifice and eat it at home. Most of the time, sacrifices are eaten within the sacred precincts, as they say, within places that we know are controlled for ritual purity. But the Korban Pesach was eaten out of sight. It was eaten at home. Families would get together and chip in to get a lamb to be eaten by their whole family. So lambs are fairly hefty animals, and the average family wouldn't necessarily be able to eat a whole lamb just by themselves. So, and you don't waste anything, as this talks about as well. So the Korban Pesach is the specific animal that was being sacrificed and eaten, and that's what the concern is about here. The concern is not about, as we're going to see later on, it's not about the rest of the Seder. The concern is specifically about that lamb, which, do we eat that nowadays at our Seders? No.
We have
No
it
temple, no altar, we don't have the sacrifice, but we do have
on the plate.
the shank bone on the plate to remind us of that sacrifice. But it isn't the sacrifice, because we can't do those sacrifices without a temple in Jerusalem.
And we're specifically not supposed to eat lamb, right?
And there is a specifically a very strong custom not to eat lamb, lest people think that you think you're eating an actual sacrifice on Passover, which is prohibited because we're not allowed to sacrifice anywhere other than the temple in Jerusalem.
Isn't there another custom where you do have a lamb barbecue or something a couple of days?
There's lots of different variations, especially between Ashkenazic and Sephardic practices on this. Exactly.
So at that, it was then that the rules as for bringing everybody in, come have the Seder with us, changed.
We'll get to that. We'll get to the role then. We'll get to the role of what do we do with all these folk when we're not talking about the actual meat of the Seder. How are we doing here? Got a side question?
All kinds of questions.
What's that? Are you stirring up trouble again? It's what happens when you sit in the back of the room. The teacher automatically assumes that you must be a troublemaker. Okay. All right. So let's see what we can do with these categories. So we have our verse 43, which the JPS translation has as being no foreigner shall eat of it. And then we're going to have the more literal translation. And again, literal doesn't mean better, but sometimes the literal English translation will highlight an aspect of it that the rabbis are going to focus on, whereas the smooth translation, not that it's wrong, simply doesn't highlight the wording in the same way that draws our attention to it. We all follow that? Right? So literal is not a judgment term of being better, but it is a necessary step in understanding why the rabbis are talking about this in such detail. All right, so the statute of the Passover sacrifice, no alienated one may partake of it. They're taking that word, the phrase kol ben nechar to mean alienated. And they're going to say, well, what does it mean to be alienated in this context? And who'd like to give us the Rashi based on the Midrash in Mechilta? Don't all jump up at once. Help save my voice. Do a mitzvah.
More literal. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover sacrifice. No alienated one may partake of it, whose deeds have become alienated from his Father in heaven. Both a Gentile and an Israelite apostate are meant."
All right, so who's covered by this category that JPS calls foreigner? Gentiles, meaning people of a different faith, not just non-Jews, but people of a different faith who are alienated from God, and
Israelite apostates.
Israelite apostates. Jews who are no longer Jewish. Not that we've stripped them of their passport, but who have openly identified with another faith. Jews who have rejected Judaism are not allowed to partake of the Korban Pesach.
Okay, then you refer to a secular Jew?
To a what?
A secular Jew?
A secular Jew? A secular Jew would be a category that wasn't really known when the rabbis were coming up with this. Pretty much there was no such thing as a secular anything in the ancient world. If you weren't Jewish, you belonged to another faith. I think we could debate amongst ourselves of whether or not practicing the mitzvot counts as a rejection of God. But certainly what the rabbis are talking about here is people who have deliberately and explicitly chosen another faith rather than Judaism, which is a rather explicit rejection of the way God has asked us to live. So the other is open for debate and interpretation, and an awful lot of passion, blood, sweat, and tears. But it's not as clear cut. So a secular Jew would not necessarily fall into this category without much debate and hand wringing. But in any case, there were no secular Jews when the Passover sacrifice was able to be offered.
I read just recently that in Israel,
Mhm.
a very high number of secular Jews, that when it comes to Passover, they still, vast majority of them, still do a Seder.
Absolutely, just like in this country.
Yes.
Just like in this country. Jews who seem to have no connection to Judaism apart from bagels and Woody Allen films will still do something like a Seder when it comes to Passover. Which might show us that secularism as opposed to apostasy, where you've actually chosen another faith, may not be quite as far from God as the other. All right, so that's one explanation, is that this alienated category, these aliens, these foreigners, can be us if we have rejected God completely and chosen another way. And Julia?
So during the Passover, and if your brother or your very close relative
Mhm.
to you, they are secular. Are you going to sit out of the house?
Well, let's take it not just your secular relative. Let's take it one step further. Let's say you have a relative who has adopted another faith. They've become Buddhist and have rejected Judaism categorically, or they've become Christian and rejected Judaism categorically. Do we have to say, get out of my house in my Seder next year?
No, that's what we were just talking about, because the Korban Pesach.
Correct. If we were offering the actual sacrifice, then we'll have to wait till we get to the last text on the sheet. Well, that's the very end of the page. But, and don't peek, but because we don't offer the Korban Pesach, we don't even have a concern that they are invalid for being in our house generally. Now, whether or not we're on good terms with them, whether or not they are going to use the family gathering to proselytize and tell everyone how stupid they think Judaism is and how much better their new faith is, that's a much more important way to decide whether or not you want to invite them to your house. And certainly someone who uses your Seder as their bully pulpit to try and convince people of the wrongness of Judaism should probably be asked to leave. But the ritual concern over the Passover sacrifice is not grounds to kick them out, because we don't have a Passover sacrifice to be worried about in our present day. Make sense? Okay. I believe you were reading. Read us our next text here. This one from Raul. Wait, no. Who was reading? Judy, you were reading? That's right. Sorry.
Okay.
The one from Raulbach, the next indent.
Just the next line.
Yeah.
This does not refer to someone from another nation who can convert to Judaism, but to someone who is of another
Thank
faith.
you. Thank you for fixing my typo. Yes. But to someone who is of another faith, even
Even an apostate Jew.
Exactly. Thank you for fixing that one too. So Raulbach goes even farther to clarify this teaching from the Mechilta, from the early Midrash, to say a foreigner here is entirely a foreigner in religion. It doesn't even necessarily mean someone who is from another nation. Someone could come from the middle of Indonesia in 2,000 years ago, and as long as they were not worshiping another faith, but were, let's say, just sort of generically neutral, they were, yes, there is one God, but I'm not Jewish, no problem having them eat from the Korban Pesach. Well, we'll talk about the circumcision stuff a little bit more, but in general, they would not be disqualified. That this phrase here, the first one that's mentioned, is really talking about their faith. That in order to eat from the sacrifice of Passover, you have to not be from a foreign faith. And your nationality neither disqualifies you nor allows you to get in on the feast if your faith is wrong. That is to say, if you are from a completely opposed faith to Judaism. Make sense? Maybe? Yes? Good.
I'm confused about the amount of time that rabbis spend on issues having to do with sacrifices that no longer happen, versus things that happen in everyday life. And how much time really is spent on practices that no longer happen?
You mean in contemporary society?
Right, or even
right.
in Rashi's time when...
Well, the issue really comes up because the topics of sacrifices, which now cannot be engaged in, were the linchpin for the positions that would later be used to determine how we should respond in other sets of circumstances. So it's not that we are studying them just in and of itself because we're interested in what they did 2,000 years ago, but because the rulings that were decided and the positions that were taken in different arguments 2,000 years ago on this topic, the topic of which may no longer be operative for us, nevertheless, those positions, that analysis, those rulings, and those principles are still very much what are going to inform our decisions in a host of other circumstances, which is actually going to lead us into the more meaty part. Get it? Sacrifice, meaty. The more meaty part of our discussion once we get past this preliminary. So this is the opening salvo to break open the topic into something which I hope will be more immediately relevant to us in our contemporary life. So, but we got the Torah we got, which means our discussions have to begin there. And that anchor is extremely important in my opinion, rather than just, as we're going to see, doing what you feel like, rather than doing it drawing through the channels of tradition. And that actually is going to become a theme very strongly in coming commentaries. All right, second commentary of our opening salvo, talking about uncircumcised. Volunteer? You don't have to blush talking about circumcision. It's not a naughty word. Please.
More literal, and every man's slave purchased for his money you shall circumcise him. Then he will be permitted to partake of it.
Okay, it's underlined, italicized, bold, and a slightly larger font on that word he, just to make sure you don't glance past it thinking you understand what it means. Because the rabbis are going to argue who is he that is being referred to in the second half of this verse? Let's hear the opinions.
Once he has been circumcised, of his own free will to turn to the religion of Israel if he is 13 or older. The text refers to a slave who was bought, but applies to even those born in the household. The purchased slave was mentioned because it is the more common occurrence.
All right, so Ibn Ezra takes what I imagine is probably the more natural reading for most of us, which is, who is the he that is now going to be permitted to eat the Korban Pesach?
The slave.
The slave himself. That prior to the circumcision, a slave in your house would not be allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. After the circumcision, the slave would be allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. That's sort of what I think most of us would consider to be the natural flow of the verse. That's what that's how JPS translates it as well, which of course means that can't be the only answer.
He means his master. This tells
What?
us.
What? He means the master? So until you've circumcised your slaves, you, the master, can't eat from the sacrifice? Why should their lack of circumcision affect my ability to chow down on Passover?
This tells us that the failure to perform the circumcision of one's slaves prevents one from partaking of the Passover sacrifice. These are the words of Rabbi Joshua.
So Rabbi Yoshua says, yes, if you are the owner of slaves and you have not circumcised them, you cannot sit down to the Passover sacrifice. Full stop. We're going to talk about why in the next paragraph, but I want to make sure we understand that is the radical position that's being advanced here.
But it also says that it has to be the slave of his own free will.
That was Ibn Ezra's opinion.
Yes.
So Ibn Ezra had a different read on this verse. And he said, no, we're talking about the slave. Very simple, very straightforward. If he's been circumcised, he can eat. If he hasn't, he can't. Let's move on. Rabbi Yoshua says, no. What we're actually talking about is the master. That the master of uncircumcised slaves doesn't get to have the Passover offering. And we're going to see that there is another opinion from the same Mechilta that disagrees with that. So keep reading.
Rabbi Eliezer says, the failure to perform the circumcision of one's slaves does not prevent one from partaking of the Passover sacrifice.
Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He says, no, whether you've circumcised your slaves or not, you still get to eat from the Korban Pesach. They don't, but you do. Keep going.
If so, what is the meaning of, then he will be permitted to partake of it? He, in this phrase, is referring to the slave.
Which again is perhaps what most of us would consider the more obvious read of the verse, which is when we say he will be able to partake of it, we mean the slave. So, uncircumcised slave, no Passover sacrifice. Circumcised slave, slave can eat it. That's Rabbi Eliezer's position. Rabbi Joshua says, uncircumcised slave, master can't eat of the Passover sacrifice. Okay? And I'm sure the question that's on everybody's mind is, why in the world would having an uncircumcised slave mean you, the master, don't get to eat from the sacrifice? And we're going to read a historical explanation by Shadal. This is Rabbi Luzzatto from the 1800s, a brilliant modern thinker who helped to, in my opinion, advance traditional Torah study in ways that were much more accessible to modern minds.
From what country?
Luzzatto was Italian. Who would like to read? Some brilliant commentary. Good choice, good opportunity.
The circumcision of the slave?
The circumcision of the slaves,
The
yes.
circumcision of the slave is an obligation on the master from Abraham.
All right, so we know this, right? Luzzatto points out, from Abraham onward, everybody knows you are supposed to circumcise your slaves. Anybody in your household, you got to circumcise, whether it be your boys or whether it be your slaves.
And if the slave says no?
Well, that's a whole other discussion. But it was considered to be, as we're going to see, a privilege. So they probably wouldn't have said no under those circumstances.
We are also commanded that the slave should rest on Shabbat and don't talk and all all of his allegations sexual slave. But he is but a bit less than his master, and therefore immediately when he is circumcised, he may eat of it as sack offering like his master.
All right, so Luzzatto points out, Shadal is his rabbinic name, that as soon as you've circumcised the slave, it is actually elevating them. It is giving them greater status within the household. It is giving them almost complete equality in many, many respects to the master of the house. And as such, it is something positive, and in the ancient world probably would have been a boon to the slave, even if he had not necessarily looked forward to the loss of that piece of flesh. It certainly increased his standing within society and within the house, and granted him privileges and rights that otherwise might not be his. And it's something that we are commanded to do anyway, even if the master didn't want to grant his slave those rights and privileges, which is why, keep reading.
And at the end of the second temple, good traits were corrupted via the kings of the house of Herod and Israel during the ways of the Gentile. And in particular, the kings' mobility and wealthy love to make themselves similar to the Romans.
All right, so he's saying the nobility, the kings, the wretched household of Herod, they were so corrupted by the Roman ways that they liked to imitate them. This is assimilation, not just in manner of dress, but in complete manners of morality, ethics, and culture. And that's going to have an important impact, according to Shadal, on this topic. Keep reading.
And we know that the Romans were cruel to their servants, and so there was in Israel some master who did not wish to circumcise their slave, such that they, the slaves, should not consider themselves Israelite continually.
All right, so according to Shadal, why would some of the masters in Israel during the end of the Second Temple period decide not to circumcise their slaves? Were they just trying to be culturally sensitive? Exactly. They didn't want to grant them the boon of being circumcised. They didn't want the slaves to get uppity and think that they were as good as the master, to think that they were true Israelites, to think that they had a share in the heritage of Israel. So they deliberately went out of their way not to circumcise as a form of cruelty, as a form of continued exploitation and subjugation.
Modeling the practices of the Romans.
Modeling the practice of the Romans, who had a typical attitude of being very, very harsh to their servants and slaves. So, whereas Jewish law is as conciliatory and as supportive as you can hope from what was still a slave-owning society, Roman society not so much. You know, in Judaism, you don't get the option to send your slaves to go fight each other to the death as being a perfectly fine use of your slaves. In Roman law, sure, no problem. I mean, if you weren't wealthy, you wouldn't, use your slaves that way because you'd be left with one fewer slaves. But legally, no problem. Judaism, you're not allowed to treat slaves like that. And unfortunately, many of the aristocracy of ancient Israel, or classical Israel, according to Shadal, were aping the manners and ethics of Rome, and as such, treated their slaves worse.
I'm a little uncomfortable, maybe I'm not reading this right. This seems to be suggesting that it is only the upper class Jew, Israelite, whatever you want to call people.
Of that time period, right?
Who were assimilated to this extent. I don't think that's right.
And that's something that would be a very interesting, longer bit of research. So we do know that the upper classes left behind more evidence of acculturation and assimilation, mostly because they left behind more evidence generally.
Right.
They had more stuff. So it's harder to know exactly how much assimilation, and especially ethical assimilation, took place on lower levels. But being in the upper echelons encouraged upper echelon Jews to try and fit in to the Roman society in order to have greater benefits and to really improve their own station within Roman occupation. Whereas the lower class people didn't have as much elbow rubbing to encourage that. So I think as a general trend, it's probably true. I think you're right. I don't think we can believe that none of the lower classes adopted Roman practices as well. I'm sure that many of them went to the circuses and went to the gladiatorial affairs and did all sorts of things that they shouldn't. But whether or not they were in this particular practice, probably they just didn't have the money to do so. It's expensive to be a slave owner. All right, keep reading.
Then the sages of Israel stood up and decreed that one who does not circumcise his slaves will not be able to eat of the Paschal offering. And their intent, in my opinion, is that one who does not consider the slave to be human is not fit to be considered among those who celebrate the festival of freedom.
Okay, let's make sure we got that. So Shadal is saying the rabbis, as typified by Rabbi Joshua that we just saw from that Mechilta, who said that it's the master who isn't allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach if he hasn't circumcised his slaves, that was a rabbinic decree. It wasn't that the rabbis were just reading the Torah and happened to come to this conclusion. It's the rabbis were watching what was happening in their society, and they used one of the few bits of leverage that was still under their control and said anybody who doesn't circumcise their slaves, thereby imitating the cruelty of the Roman oppressors, is not going to be allowed to have the Passover sacrifice, which we know is still important to you guys, even if you are imitating more and more of the Roman attitudes. As we already pointed out, even today, people who have rejected Judaism many other ways still want to have a Seder. It was true in the ancient world as well. And therefore they had a piece of leverage, the rabbis did, to say, if you're not going to at least embrace this aspect of equality and celebration of freedom, you don't get to taste the sacrifice of freedom, the sacrifice of Pesach. What do we think of that explanation? Sound good? Maybe? Certainly plausible. Certainly plausible. But what it's saying is, make sure we understand this aspect before we continue, is that Rabbi Joshua's opinion in the Mechilta was social legislation, not just Torah interpretation. Okay, it was only feasible because there was a Torah verse that would work to support it. I mean, you can't just legislate by fiat. It's not a good car company either, I hear. But he only made the proclamation and the sages supported it because of the attitudes of the people in the community, because of this social problem of how so many people were beginning to treat their servants, their slaves, worse and worse.
Well, part of the Seder brings out the fact that we're not just celebrating our own freedom,
correct,
but that we're condemning slavery.
Correct. And a vision of Pesach that doesn't include an aspiration for universal liberation and freedom is not a complete vision. And the rabbis were trying to draw their attention to that point, the attention of the aristocracy that they were condemning in one of the few ways they could. You know, after all, just shouting at them doesn't work, but if you control their meat supply...
In this context, though, isn't a slave thought of as more of a household employee rather than...
Well, within Jewish context, yes. In most circumstances, a slave is very different from what we think of as a slave in the Western experience. However, during the Roman times, there was this other notion of slavery that was being transposed into Jewish culture. And apparently, according to Shadal, more and more of the Jews were adopting this notion of, well, my slave is my property that I can treat and abuse as I wish, as opposed to Torah and Jewish interpretation of Torah, which says, no, your slave is, yes, somebody who has sold their labor to you for a perpetual period of time, but it's not infinite, and your rights over them are not infinite. There are limits to what you can do and what you can't do.
It's more, in the Jewish tradition, it was more like an indentured.
Under most circumstances, yes, exactly.
They didn't go out and raid the village and take all the people back and force slavery.
Rarely. during the conquest and settlement of Canaan, of Israel, was where that occurred more typically. But during the longest periods of Jewish history, that wasn't the model exactly. But let's go ahead, and I want to make sure we get enough time to finish these ideas, and then we can have more time for some questions. Please continue.
This was the thought process of most of the sages, and so it is taught without attribution of the natural thought.
But, next page, but,
Rabbi Eliezer said that the circumcision of slave is not a requirement for being able to eat ask for offering, for he seized upon the death of Shemai, and he did not wish that anything be innovated at all, which was not in the Torah or in the received tradition. He did not say anything unless he heard it from his teacher.
Okay, so if you remember the Mechilta that we first read, Rabbi Eliezer said, no, where it says uncircumcised, it means the slave himself. Nothing about the master, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer argued against this position, not because he was in favor of mistreating slaves, but simply because he saw no grounds for it in the Torah, and he had not been taught this interpretation. And he was not going to innovate something new if he hadn't been taught it. Does that make sense? He didn't approve of the practice of mistreating the slaves, but he didn't think restricting their masters from having access to the Korban Pesach was legitimate, because that's not the way it had been taught to him. And he wasn't going to invent a new interpretation. Make sense? And as Shabel points out, that's considered to be from the path of Shammai, the house of Shammai. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. But let's finish off this section. Meanwhile,
the rest of the sages of Israel were innovating the institution according to the needs of the time, and they needed to replace Rabbi Eliezer
in Cherem, which is like an excommunication, a ban. So no one would talk with him, no one would deal with him. He was put under not exactly house arrest, but he was sort of shunned in the society until he changed his opinion.
For he rose up against anything which leaned away from that which he received from his teacher.
Okay, so they say, Rabbi Eliezer, and this comes across in a few other places in his teachings, I'm sorry, if you're not willing to agree with the enactments of the community, then you're putting yourself outside the community. And he said, but that's not the way it was taught. That's not what the law said when my teacher told me it. And they said, yes, but this is the way we're interpreting it now. And it was an uncomfortable situation. What's that?
The conservatives and the liberals.
Conservatives and liberals are one way to put it, and we'll come back to that motif at the very end. But I want to make sure that before we get to the very end, where it becomes a little bit more philosophical, we do understand the ancient a bit better, okay? In case you think that the Korban Pesach and its restriction to only a very narrow set of people, Jews who have been circumcised, that are following the faith of their fathers, etc., was typical among the sacrificial system, we have a number of sources that are there in the middle of that back page that explain that no, other sacrifices from foreigners were brought and served at the altar of Jerusalem with some regularity. So it wasn't as though others couldn't bring sacrifices. It was just this one that they were not allowed to. It was just this one that they were not allowed to participate in. And more to the question of, well, what about at the Seder itself? Were they allowed at the Seder, even if they couldn't eat the Korban Pesach? The Mechilta to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which is another Mechilta than the one we have been reading from. We'll talk about that another time if you like. It says very clearly, one might think that an uncircumcised foreigner would invalidate the group with them, meaning you're not even allowed to have him at the table. But Torah states, no foreigner shall eat of it, meaning the sacrifice. He does not eat it, the Korban Pesach, but he does eat the matzah and maror. So even in the ancient times when these uncircumcised foreigners were not allowed to have the sacrifice, that didn't mean they couldn't come to the Seder. They could still be at the Seder, they could still eat the matzah, they could still eat the maror, they could still drink from the 4 cups of wine, they could still be a participant, they just couldn't have the meat.
They were vegetarian.
They were vegetarian. They had the matzo ball soup with the chicken. That was enough. It was okay. It was okay. You know, the first taste of matzo ball soup for a foreigner, that sends them over the edge. They don't need the meat. Okay? Okay, but let's come back to this question of the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the other sages of how to decide of what to do. And it's going to hinge, and this is Shadal continuing, it's going to hinge around this distinction between Hillel and Shammai, or more especially between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, between the houses of Hillel, the houses of Shammai, which means the schools, the academies. It's the school of thought would be a better way to translate it into English, of those two great sages. Okay, so who'd like to take us through these last few paragraphs in our last few minutes? Please, Edie.
A Gentile.
No, pick up from Hillel and Shammai.
Hillel and Shammai only argued in 2 or 3 matters. And when their students who did not sufficiently serve their teachers increased, disputes increased in Israel, and the Torah was made into 2 Torahs.
Their students who did not sufficiently serve their teachers increased. Does that mean they didn't wash their cars often enough, didn't bring them coffee, no apples for the teacher? What do they mean by they didn't sufficiently serve their teachers?
Teach the way the teachers taught.
They didn't learn correctly from their teachers to then continue to teach exactly what their teachers had taught them. They weren't great students. They weren't bad people, but they didn't attend to their teachers' words with enough attention to ensure correct and accurate transmission of all their teachers were trying to tell them. So it's kind of like they went to the lectures, but they didn't take very good notes. And therefore, when it came time for them to be the professors, they had to sort of fill in the gaps on their own. And as such, the, in quote, students of Shammai and students of Hillel, which we'll talk about that title in just a moment, ended up with 2 very different ways of filling in their gaps and how they would then try to teach the law. Does that make sense? Hillel and Shammai themselves didn't disagree fundamentally on very much. But their students, who didn't take good notes, when it was their turn to be the leaders, didn't have an accurate representation of either of their teachers' views, which were almost identical, and so they both interpreted in their own spirits in ways that ended up being radically different from each other, and thus created conflict. Does that pattern make sense? Okay, let's finish off the story here
We
then.
must ask, why were these called the students of Shammai and Hillel, as the different positions didn't come from their teachers, but rather from their own logic? They should have been called the stringent ones and the lenient ones, or some other names, but not based on Hillel and Shammai, who were not the source of the disputes.
Poor Hillel and Shammai. They get 2 schools named after them, neither of which is following their teachings. And Shadal points out quite rightly, why did we call it Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai? It should have been Beit lenient and Beit stringent, and left poor Hillel and Shammai out of it, because it wasn't their disputes that their students were perpetuating. It was new disputes that these these students, when they grew up, perpetuated, that they invented. So it seems totally unfair to Shadal, and I have to agree with him, that poor Hillel and Shammai go down into history as though they were enemies, when in fact the 2 of them were partners within the Sanhedrin and partners in teaching, and did quite well together and barely disagreed at all.
The terms stringent and lenient you can refer to as conservative and liberal.
Let's keep going and we'll decide, because he's going to explain why those terms would be more useful and why we ended up calling one Hillel and one Shammai, even though the disputes didn't originate with Hillel and Shammai. So we'll hold off on identifying modern groups as being one or the other. Keep reading.
It seems to me is that since Hillel was humble in his character traits, a lover and pursuer of peace, who loved people and brought them close to Torah, and as he said to that Gentile, love your neighbor as yourself, that is the entirety of Torah.
The old standing on one foot answer of teach me everything.
From there extends most of the students who did not serve their teacher sufficiently and cleaved to Hillel to learn his traits and to follow in his path. When they had a doubt in a matter of one of the rules or laws, they chose to be lenient in order to draw the common folk to Torah, so that the yoke upon their necks should not become too weighty, such that they might cast it off their necks entirely. And these students were called Beit Hillel, since they seized the path of Hillel, despite the fact that these details in which they argued did not come out to them from Hillel's mouth.
Okay. Why are they called Beit Hillel? Give me a summary. Because they were students, but they weren't students so well of his facts. What did they? But of his midot, of his character, of his personality traits. And so they adopted well the style of their teacher, even though they forgot the actual teachings. And so when it came time to fill in the blanks, as it were, they relied not on his teachings, which they didn't have, but on his personality to interpret the law. And so therefore they ended up, more consistently than not, taking lenient positions on many different aspects of Jewish law. Because they figured, let's be nice, let's help people come in, let's make it more open, more inclusive, more inviting, less onerous, because that's what Hillel would want. Right? Whereas the other camp?
And so the reverse. Shammai was a strict, insistent man, and he was insistent on every matter, not to lean from the line of the law even a hair's breadth. And some of the students chose his path, and when a doubt came about for them because they did not serve sufficiently, they chose to be stringent. And they are called Beit Shammai, since they were drawn after the position of Shammai, who was insistent to be stringent, despite their reasoning not coming to them from him.
All right, so Shammai as a person had a very different personality than Hillel. Even though, as Shadal pointed out, Hillel and Shammai themselves rarely disagreed on law, they still had very different personalities. And their students are their students, less by virtue of remembering their law, which even if they had, would have been almost identical, but by remembering their character and using that to fill in the blanks.
What I find interesting is, if their personalities were so divergent, yet on rules of law, they were almost the same, then that says something completely different. If you're so strict, why are you ruling the same as Hillel, who's so lenient?
Why? And why would he? If Shammai was so strict and don't deviate from the law a hair's breadth and be stern and insistent, why would he almost always end up ruling exactly the same as Mr. Birkenstock's Kumbaya lovey-dovey Hillel, at least that's the way it's being portrayed here? Why would it be that they would both end up teaching almost identical in almost every case? Because that's what the law was. They weren't deciding the law based upon their personality. They were deciding the law based upon what they actually believed the law to be. Their personality was secondary to the understanding of what they had learned from their teachers and what they were able to understand from the Torah. Their personality flavored how they taught. It flavored how they interacted with people beyond the letter of the law. But the law itself was independent of their personality. And their students missed that point. Their students took their personality as being what had made them come to the conclusions they came to. And therefore said, well, I don't need to remember all this stuff. As long as I'm like him, I'll continue to rule and make decisions like him. And therefore, rather than the law in and of itself, and an understanding of the process of making the law in and of itself being the paramount focus of their learning, emulation of the personality became the focus. And as such, stringency and leniency became virtues rather than simple character traits. There's no reason that one should prefer to be stringent or prefer to be lenient as a matter of course. There are cases within Jewish law where when we are unclear, we should default to one position or the other, but we shouldn't hold them up as being virtues in and of themselves. The law is a virtue. Torah is a virtue. Trying to best understand what God has asked us to do is a virtue. If that happens to be stringent, then we should be stringent. If that happens to be lenient, we should be lenient. And we shouldn't be sad about either outcomes. And we shouldn't answer our doubts simply by ruling one way or the other because we liked the person who taught us, and they happen to be one way or the other in their personality.
So the both Hillel and Shammai went from the same law, but their personalities determined the application of that law.
It determined the flavoring of how they said it. You know, when the very famous case of a convert who came to Shammai and said, I want to convert, but you have to make me a Kohen, which of course is impossible. You have to be born a Kohen. You can't convert and then get to be one. Shammai told him to go away because he couldn't do that. And when he went to Hillel, Hillel said, fine, I'll convert you, and then began to teach him. And the convert learned that it was impossible for him to become a Kohen. Well, both of them agreed on the law. You can't make a convert into a Kohen. But the way they presented it was very, very different. Neither of them changed the law. Neither of them broke the law. But both of them flavored how they were going to explain the law and reach out to others very, very differently. And that we do have a choice about. And that we can even argue about which is better or worse. But they didn't decide the law because in one way or the other because Shammai didn't want to be lenient or Hillel wanted to be lenient. They decided the law of converts can't become Kohanim. Now how am I going to tell that to this person? And they both chose very different ways to tell it, not to decide it. And unfortunately, in contemporary society, we often focus much more on how we're going to tell it as being the vehicle for deciding it. Well, I can't decide that way because how could I explain it? Well, that's not the determining factor. What is the right thing to do? What is it the Torah, tradition, and God has asked us to do? And now, how can I explain it? And then that will vary from person to person, absolutely. But that's not our determining factor. And when we make it the determining factor, either in favor of stringency or in favor of leniency, that's where we get into trouble. We get into trouble lots of places, but those are two of the big places that we get into trouble. Because now we've created external factors for determining the law that have nothing to do with the law itself. And as such, we stumble.
Do you think that one philosophy encourages conversion and the other philosophy may discourage conversion?
Philosophy, yes. I think Judaism itself is open to people who wish to convert, but I think the attitude of the community will make converts feel more welcomed and feel more accepted once they have converted, as opposed to the attitude of others. But the law itself is open and accepting. But how we present it, yes, can make a very big difference. So I'm not saying that the flavoring is immaterial, but the flavoring has to come after the law has been determined. It's not something which determines the law itself. And that is something that is very important to remember in every stream of Judaism, which is why I hesitate to say any one particular stream is like Hillel or Shammai or such, because they all have tendencies to try and find a way to do what they feel they should do first before deciding what the law actually is. And it's a little cart before the horse. Little cart before the horse.
And also it points to, I guess, a fatal flaw in Judaism, in that the further you get away from Mount Sinai and the delivery of the law, as you go thousands and thousands and thousands of years out, the more corrupted has become the thinking and further away from the basic intent of the law in the first place.
I would hesitate to use the word corrupted, simply because I do believe that we can find the right way to live according to Torah in every generation, and that God did not, God's message doesn't diminish like ripples in a pond. It doesn't get smaller the further away from Sinai, but it does mean we have to continually be very careful how we rebroadcast that message. That each generation has a sacred duty to make sure our students know we're not doing this because we want to. We're not doing this because we agree with the feeling of this law. We're doing it because we believe it's a mitzvah, because we believe it's a commandment. We have a sacred duty to interpret and to adapt as necessary to each generation, but we don't do that just because of how we feel. Once we've decided what the law is, then yes, we're going to have our own way of making that be applicable to the world around us. But we need to make sure our students are not deficient, so that it doesn't get corrupted, as you say, but can be maintained in the way it should be. So it's not an inevitable corruption, but it's one that we are very prone to. And there's one that's also, I have to say, very psychologically tempting, because those that teach like to feel that they're important and like to feel that their way of teaching is important. And it's very easy to begin to put that as being more important than what's actually being taught, and to want to encourage some form of idolization of the teacher by the students. But unfortunately, the more the teacher remembers the teacher, the less they remember the content. And that's not something that we want to have happen when it comes to Torah. All right, take care, everyone, and hope to see you all again next week.
Thank you.